They literally changed it, right? From recently returned from serving in Iraq, recently returned from serving in Italy. And this whole thing has been allowed to be faked for a long time.
He was promoted to sergeant major, but then in order to stay in that rank, you have to complete certain training. You have to complete the Sergeant Major's Academy, which he never did. So he was subsequently demoted to Master Sergeant before he retired.
He said we shouldn't allow weapons that I used in war to be on America's streets. Well, I wonder, Tim Waltz, when were you ever in war? What was this weapon that you carried into war, given that you abandoned your unit right before they went to Iraq, and he has not spent a day in a combat zone?
Tim Walz's stolen valor problem continues to get worse and worse by the day. We have this new clip that is out where he actually is saying that he handled weapons of war in war. I carried them in war is the specific language that he uses, and it turns out he never did that. So we'll play this video clip, and it comes from Kamala HQ herself. She's sharing this all over the place, and it's just not good for him. Bunch of clips here. JD Vance also comes out at the end of this and obliterates him, saying that he's mocking his credentials at Yale and these other things, but he actually went to Iraq, and it's a beautiful thing. But they're also trying to clean this up, and it's pretty disgusting. So we have this from Bloomberg, which you'll see is changing an old fake story where Walz says he served in Iraq. They're just changing it, and they're switching it over to Italy, going back in time and changing it and not updating the editor's note to confirm that, right? And for this entire time, he says he returned from serving in Iraq. He didn't. He served in Italy. And so they're changing the whole thing. It's rewriting history because they're little communists. But here is the clip. This is what he said. It's getting worse and worse. Just every single clip is like, oh my gosh, are you serious? How did they not vet this dude? But here it is. Tim Walz saying, I carried weapons in war. No, you didn't. You were in Italy.
Hope woke up like many of you did 5 weeks ago and said, Dad, you're the only person I know who's in elected office. You need to stop what's happening with this. I'll take my kick in the butt for the NRA. I spent 25 years in the Army and I hunt. And I gave the money back, and I'll tell you what I have been doing. I've been voting for common sense legislation that protects the Second Amendment, but we can do background checks. We can do CDC research. We can make sure we don't have reciprocal carry among states, and we can make sure that those weapons of war that I carried in war is the only place where those weapons are at.
Those weapons of war that I carried in war. No, you didn't, dude. That's a big problem. You don't have to go that far. You just say, you know, I served. I wasn't in combat, but I did serve, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. But when you start to embellish and say that you did a bunch of stuff that you didn't do, people start to notice. And in fact, it goes way beyond that. So here is what Jordan Schachtel has discovered. A great report on stolen valor over from his Substack, reposted at the top of our timeline if you're following along at home. Tim Walz launched his political career. Okay, the whole thing was birthed out of this disgusting lie, a scam, claiming that he was a combat veteran in the war on terror. Says in his first major interview while running for Congress, the now VP candidate said he ran for office after fighting in Iraq. Wrong. Nuh-uh. Didn't happen. Here's the article over from the Substack, Jordan Schachtel's dossier.today. He says, all right, the story goes back way to the beginning of his political career. From the onset of his foray into politics, Walz sold himself as a combat veteran, and he went and dug up the articles that show us this. He says, thanks to some quality reporting, we know that the Minnesota governor, who officially joined the ticket, quit the military in 2005 after learning that his battalion was about to be sent to Iraq, spent his entire career there, and then bailed at the last minute. He did 6 months overseas to Italy on the taxpayer dime. Now he learned he was going to lead people into battle, and then he bailed. But that's not what Tim Walz told the public when he decided to run for office. Just months after leaving his battalion to go to Iraq, he announced, I'm going to run for Congress. And the disassembling about his service record began immediately. Now, they could have just been honest about it. That's not true at all. Here is a screen clipping from another article from Bloomberg. Joshua Green wrote this article. He was then employed at The Atlantic, was the first major reporter to write a profile on this dude. And here's what it looked like. Company left. There's something different about the latest crop of military veterans running for Congress. Command Sergeant Major Tim Walz, which is not his rank, is a 24-year veteran of the Army National Guard, now retired, still on active duty. High school teacher, he had left to serve overseas in Operation Enduring Freedom. Says southern Minnesota is home to a large Guard contingent that includes Walz's unit, which he didn't go. And so the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are naturally a pressing local concern, particularly to high school students. He said that he also is now retired, but he's a high school teacher, and he had left to serve in overseas Operation Enduring Freedom. Now, we don't know if Green, okay, actually what the deal was, but he's a veteran reporter. We don't know if he's omitting major facts or if he's being sold on a narrative, but this assertion is misleading. It leaves the reader thinking that he was boots on the ground. It makes you think that he was there in Operation Enduring Freedom in Iraq. He was not. So that was like a little bit of a fake. It gets much worse. Green discusses a 2004 visit from Bush. He writes, his challenge prompted a KGB-style interrogation that was characteristic of Bush. Do you support the president? Walz refused to answer. Do you oppose the president? Walz replied that it's no one's business but his own. Walz thought for a moment and asked the Bush staffers if they really wanted to arrest a command sergeant major. Are you really going to arrest a command sergeant major, not your rank, who just returned from fighting the war on terror? While the first instance can be written off as an issue of unclear reporting, the second is not, all right? Walz was not just serving in a support role from Italy. He had been fighting the war on terrorism. Now, according to the article, Walz was picked out of relative obscurity by Democrat operatives due to his military service. These operatives went out and recruited veterans. To this day, Green remains under the false impression, the author of that piece, that Walz served and fought in the war. In the piece for Bloomberg on Tuesday, he wrote that Walz served in Iraq as part of Operation Enduring Freedom. But it's a false construct. As soon as shots were fired, he turned and ran the other way. And he continues to lie about it, as we just saw in that clip. And Bloomberg is stealth editing this. It's insane to watch him do this. Bonchi Red State, over a great follow on X, says, Bloomberg has now stealth edited the claim that Walz served in Iraq. The claim was originally made by the same reporter, Joshua Green, back in 2004. Alan Levy clipped this one, lawyer from New York and New Jersey. They literally changed it, right? From recently returned from serving in Iraq, recently returned from serving in Italy. And this whole thing has been allowed to be faked for a long time. Now, the National Guard is now confirming that he was in fact demoted. We'll see if he answers any questions about this, but so far nothing. The Minnesota National Guard, according to our friends at Just the News, say that they confirmed on Wednesday that Walz was demoted and did not retire as a command sergeant major like he says all the time. While Walz temporarily held the title, it was temporary and he made a bunch of commitments in order to make it not temporary anymore. Retired as master sergeant is what they said. That's according to Army Lieutenant Colonel Kristen Augie, who is the public affairs officer, said no. He retired as a master sergeant in 2005 for benefit purposes because he did not complete additional coursework at the Sergeant's Major Academy. He made a commitment to do it and then failed, and then claims that he completed this and that he maintains the title. Now, a lot of what they'll say is that, well, he was acting for a little bit, like he got like a temporary positional elevation and so he can claim it forever. No, everybody else completed their coursework. They did the job, they sat for the exams, and they did it. It'd be like if somebody just graduated law school or didn't, or like halfway through law school, didn't even take the bar exam, and they're like, yeah, but I'm a lawyer though. And they walked into court like, I'm a lawyer. Get the hell out of here. No, you are not. The judge would not even entertain it because you actually have to do the thing. The statement reignited controversy because the governor's biography says that Command Sergeant Major Walz retired from the National Guard. No, you didn't. The National Guard disputed his description. They said, okay, officially, Governor Walz served from April 8th to 2005, Walz serving in Minnesota, blah, 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 and culminated in a career serving as a command sergeant. He had multiple positions within the field artillery, firing battery, all these things, serving as a command sergeant major for the battalion, right? So he did serve temporarily, and then he was fled, basically. Like he was on the track to actually earn the title and then fled. He retired not as a command sergeant major, but as a master sergeant, even though he was on the path to do that. Now, according to Army Regulation 600.8.19, a soldier who does not complete the requisite coursework is automatically demoted. It's automatic. His military career is now under scrutiny. We saw 2 retired actual command sergeants major wrote an open letter. We covered that yesterday, and they just obliterated him. He said, when your country called, you're supposed to run into battle, not the other way. But he left. Scrutiny is now coming up. A lot of people calling it stolen valor. It's not just us. Other people, John Kerry and others, were caught in this bigly. CNN is even confirming this. They did a little bit of a fact check on this one, and they say, yeah, there's a little bit of a difference here. You can't say that you did all those things if you didn't actually do those things, because the people who did do those things made tremendous sacrifices. Many of them, the ultimate sacrifices, and they're not here. So you don't get to dress up like the Democrats love to do and pretend that you're somebody that you're not.
Waltz did make a comment, speaking to a group, he's done it a couple of times, where he has used language that has suggested that he carried weapons in a fighting situation. As you know, with your contact with the military, I know from coming from a military family, there is a difference between being in a combat area, being involved at a time of war, and actually being in a position where people are shooting at you. There is no evidence that at any time Governor Waltz was in a position of being shot at, and some of his language could easily be seen to suggest that he was. So that is absolutely false when he said that about gun rights out there.
Yep, so he's a liar, and people are seeing that. Now, you'll hear also from Representative Mike Waltz, who is someone concerned about this, says, I've seen the reports on his record, and he has some explaining to do. Here's another congressman.
Hey, a lot of discussion out there in the veterans community about Governor Tim Walz's military record, and I think it boils down to two issues. One is the fact that he's described himself over his political career as a sergeant major, as the highest enlisted rank in the Army. He was promoted to sergeant major, but then in order to stay in that rank, you have to complete certain training. You have to complete the Sergeant Major's Academy, which he never did. So he was subsequently demoted to Master Sergeant before he retired. A lot of questions there on how he should be describing himself, and I think those are fair to ask, and he should answer them. And then the bigger issue is walking away from his soldiers after they had been called to go to Iraq. I commanded Green Berets. Everything that you do prepares you for that moment when you have to lead your men and women into harm's way. It's kind of like the quarterback of a big team walking away from their team right before they go to the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
I've never heard anything like it, especially the fact that he was a command sergeant major. I've never heard of a commander or sergeant major stepping away from their unit before they go down range. The media needs to do their job and ask these tough questions, and Walz needs to answer them. The veterans community, for one, is demanding an explanation of why he didn't fulfill his duty as a command sergeant major and go into harm's way with the men and women he was leading.
We think we know why, because he's a coward, didn't want to go over there and actually do what he signed up to do. Now, this is someone else who is on this train, says from Hung Cow. This is a gentleman who is a husband, father, retired Navy captain, running for the U.S. Senate, endorsed by President Trump. He writes, look, I have tried to take my time in responding to stories about Tim Walz's service record. The hypocrisy astounds me. Because I am a Trump supporter and running against a liberal career politician, a so-called Pentagon correspondent, okay, some media troll hack, asked me to provide documented evidence of every time I had been outside the wire on a deployment and every time I received incoming enemy fire, okay? So some journo hack is like, well, you have documents to support that? Can you email me something about that? Where's your documents? Where's your forms? Meanwhile, Walz can make up whatever the hell he wants. Nobody asks him for any backup. I was asked, he says, to provide my medical records, and I was grilled about why my brain injury didn't earn me a Purple Heart. Now you contrast that with Tim Walz, whose entire political career appears to be based on a lie, that he served in Iraq when he did not. He exaggerated his rank in an effort to disarm law-abiding Americans. He implied he had seen combat when he never did. All I know for sure is when I was deployed to Iraq, I never saw Tim Walz there. In the Navy, we used to talk about something called pulling a deployment muscle. Oh no, my back hurts. I can't go to Afghanistan. Oh no. It seems to me that Tim Walz might have just suffered that. Now, while it upsets me to read how Walz abandoned his unit before the deployment, it frankly upsets me more that this man spent 20 years as a candidate and in elected office, now seeking the vice presidency of the United States, and no one in the media asked him before or since any simple questions like, you were deployed to Iraq, weren't you, Tim? Why did you quit so you didn't have to go and then imply that you did? Why? Now, the truth is, we all know the answer, and it's disqualifying for future service as our president. Boom. Now, here is another gentleman, J.R. Salzman and Kurt Schlichter, other veterans who are showing images of them there. And you know who's missing in this photo right here, right next to him? Tim Walz. It's like the Where's Waldo game. Anybody here can identify Tim Walz in this photo? No, Tim Walz is not there. This other guy's there. Here's another guy, Tim Walz, not in this photograph. But you know who did go serve? We have J.D. Vance, who was there. We're going to listen to him, but Tim Walz got asked about this, and he didn't want to answer any questions. So they brought out some kids to provide cover. All right, just put the kids in front of us, okay? So we don't have to answer any questions here. No one's going to answer questions. There's kids here. So here is what looked like when they were trying not to answer questions today.
Governor, Vance accused you of stolen valor. Your response. Governor. Governor, Vance accused you of stolen valor. Your response.
No response. All right, so I don't want to answer any questions. One person who is answering a lot of questions lately is JD Vance. And JD Vance crushes this. Someone who actually went over and did serve in Iraq and doesn't lie about it is JD Vance. And here is how he is settling this issue with the media.
Last night, Governor Waltz suggested that because of your Ivy League education and your Silicon backing your political career, that you yourself are part of the elite. What are your first impressions of them trying to frame you this way to the American public?
Well, look, I came from a family where nobody in my family had ever gone to law school. I grew up in a poor family. The fact that Tim Waltz wants to turn it into a bad thing, that I actually worked myself through college, through law school, and made something myself, to me, that's the American dream. And if Tim Waltz wants to insult it, I think that's frankly pretty bizarre. Now, look, what really bothers me about Tim Waltz, it's not even the positions that he's taken, though certainly he has been a far left radical. You know what really bothers me about Tim Waltz as a Marine who served his country in uniform? When the United States Marine Corps, when the United States of America asked me to go to Iraq to serve my country, I did it. I did what they asked me to do it, and I did it honorably, and I'm very proud of that service. When Tim Waltz was asked by his country to go to Iraq, you know what he did? He dropped out of the Army and allowed his unit to go without him, a fact that he's been criticized for aggressively by a lot of the people that he served with. I think it's shameful to prepare your unit to go to Iraq, to make a promise that you're going to follow through, and then to drop out right before you actually have to go. I also think it's dishonest. Something, again, if you guys ever get an opportunity to ask Tim Waltz or Kamala Harris some questions, he made this interesting comment that the Kamala Harris campaign put out there, and I bet regretting they put it out there now, and he was making a point about gun control. He said we shouldn't allow weapons that I used in war to be on America's streets. Well, I wonder, Tim Waltz, when were you ever in war? What was this weapon that you carried into war, given that you abandoned your unit right before they went to Iraq, and he has not spent a day in a combat zone? What bothers me about Tim Waltz is the stolen valor garbage. Do not pretend to be something that you're not. And if he wants to criticize me for getting an Ivy League education, I'm proud of the fact that my mamaw supported me, that I was able to make something of myself. I'd be ashamed if I was him and I lied about my military service like he did.
Shout out to Meemaw and shout out to JD Vance just crushing that question. And, you know, he's right. He was not in a combat zone. And Minneapolis and the 3rd precinct there that was burnt to the ground, that doesn't count, right? That's civilian riots courtesy of BLM that you allowed there, Tim. That's not Iraq as much as you want it to be.